So my name is Haley Brown. I am a research associate at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. And today I'm going to be discussing the pandemic employment situation for working age individuals with disabilities. I wanted to start by thanking everyone, particularly the organizers of this conference, for inviting me to speak with you today. So before we can delve into the employment question, it's important to establish what and who we mean when we use the word disabled. There are a lot of different definitions and approaches out there, and we need to understand what we are measuring and, just as importantly, what we are not measuring. So here, what I have are three examples of different types of definitions. The first is a legal definition drawn from the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a landmark piece of legislation that actually celebrated its 30th anniversary this past July. The purpose of that definition is to determine legally protected categories with the aim of preventing discrimination in a wide variety of areas, but one of those areas is employment. The example in the middle is drawn from a few surveys, specifically the Current Population Survey and the American Community Survey, where they ask a series of yes or no questions about different types of difficulties. And then the one all the way to the right is from the World Health Organization, which is a broader classification that accounts for environmental factors. So to measure employment, we're going to be using data from the basic monthly current population survey, which defines disability using the 6 questions related to the ones in the middle on the previous slide. Each question is asked individually, and people can answer yes or no to each one individually. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the definitions of the final two, just because the titles of them may not be as intuitive. So independent living difficulty refers to having difficulty doing things like running errands alone or getting to a doctor's office or shopping, that type of thing. And then personal care refers to difficulty dressing or bathing. So there are also multiple ways of measuring employment. One way, the more commonly cited way when people talk about jobs numbers and whatnot, is the unemployment rate, which only includes people who are actively in the workforce, so people who are either employed or actively looking, or say that they're actively looking for another job. This can be a misleading way to measure employment, particularly for individuals with disabilities, because a lot of them may, for whatever reason, not fall into that. The ones without jobs may not actively fall into that unemployment denominator. So what you can probably, these are two charts tracking both the employment to population ratio, which I'm going to call EPOP, which has a denominator that includes everybody within that age group and not just those who actively say that they're looking for work or who are already employed, and then the unemployment rate. I'm going to be using EPOP to measure employment because it's a more holistic way of looking at the situation for people with disabilities. So what you can probably see from the first chart is that, well, two things. The percent change from April to September 2019, the year before the pandemic, and April through September 2020, which is during the pandemic, is actually about the same for those who say that they have a disability and those who say that they don't. The other thing I'd like to draw attention to is the fact that both in 2019 and in 2020, the vast majority of those with disabilities are not employed. That said, so I know I said that the no disability and disability communities had the same rate of change in EPOP, but the disability community is not a monolith. And so when you break it down by different types of disabilities, you end up getting a much more nuanced, larger spread. So for example, people who say that they have a vision difficulty or cognitive difficulties are actually had a smaller percent change between pre-pandemic and pandemic than those with no disability at all. Whereas people with personal care difficulties, it's more than twice the amount. However, it is also important to keep in mind that a lot of people have more than one disability. So the previous chart, the categories included people who have more than one disability. And here you can see the ratio for each category of people who say that they have more than one disability. So for those last two, independent living and personal care, most of those people have more than one disability. So here it's broken down paying attention to those who only have that type of disability and those who have that disability and other types. And one thing that I think is interesting to note is that for the independent living for those who say that they have difficulty with independent living, those who only have an independent living difficulty are much more affected during the pandemic than those who have an independent living difficulty plus some other type of difficulty, whereas the reverse is true for the personal care group. And again, keep in mind that most people in both of those groups say that they have more than one disability. So I want to talk a little bit about the limitations of the basic monthly current population survey, which is the survey that I'm using to measure employment and disability. It specifically has some limitations with regard to capturing those with disabilities. And among 4 different surveys that are out there, it tends to report the lowest prevalence of disability, both because the questions aren't as broad and the scope of who is administered the survey in the first place is smaller. So there are a few potential policy implications for these results. The first is that affordable access to healthcare services is really important for those with disabilities to remain in the workforce. There is a report by Mathematica where they looked at focus groups, and those with disabilities, even when they have traditional health insurance, tend to be much more burdened by high health costs. There are also limitations to current programs where full workforce integration can jeopardize their eligibility for those programs, and even things like SSI, or supplemental security insurance, where those with disabilities cannot have more than $2,000 at any one time in their bank account, which prevents them from being able to, say, pay for unexpected health costs. Some more policy implications include that pandemic mitigation measures need to be disability inclusive. This means prioritizing personal protective equipment for care workers who make it possible for those with personal care difficulties and independent living difficulties to remain in the workforce. This can also take the form of guaranteeing paid family and medical leave so that if those caregivers are family members, they have the time that they need to devote to helping their other family members stay in the workforce. It's also important to consider the way that disability and other demographic factors intersect with one another. There's often like a poverty, marginalized community, disability, employment nexus, and it's a loop. And one way to break that loop is to be mindful of the ways that those different things intersect with one another. And finally, and this refers back to the previous presentations during this session, is that it may be time to reevaluate what constitutes a reasonable accommodation, specifically with regard to remote work. There are many people with disabilities who, when they previously requested to work remotely, were told, no, that wasn't a reasonable accommodation, and it clearly is. I know I'm starting to run short on time, so I'll try to make this part quick. There's also additional research questions that would help us understand who is being affected and how they're being affected within different disability groups. Unfortunately, the sample size of the data, if you want to divide it up by the type of disability, is not quite there yet, but hopefully as more data becomes available, it'll be possible to look at more fine-grained occupational information, looking at part-time versus full-time, and getting a more specific idea of the role of educational attainment, socioeconomic status, and other things like that. And with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.